Allama Muhammad Iqbal was a pivotal and renowned Islamic philosopher-poet of the subcontinent. Widely known for his extensive poetry in both Urdu and Persian, Iqbal attempted to reimagine an assertive yet authentic Islam, deftly navigating the pulse of Western modernism and Islamic traditionalism. His philosophy and poetry are richly steeped in Sufi mysticism. Here, we will explore Iqbal's legacy in Pakistan, in the wider Muslim world, and even in the non-Muslim world. How can Iqbal help us reimagine the world of nation states? How can Iqbal help us imagine a more just and peaceful world? Without further ado, I will introduce our panelists today. Our keynote speaker is Mr. Qasim Qureshi, retired Major General from the Pakistani Army. Mr. Qureshi has held numerous diplomatic assignments, including High Commissioner of Pakistan in Sri Lanka from 2013 to 2015. A student of Allama Iqbal's life and work, Mr. Qureshi holds multiple degrees, including an MSc in Defense and Strategic Studies and 2 MAs in War Studies and International Studies from King's College, London. Mr. Qureshi will speak for 20 minutes, and his talk will be followed by brief 5-minute remarks from our panelists. After this, we will open the floor or our Zoom meeting for discussion and questions from our audience. Our first response will be made by TJ Liguori, who is the Khalid and Diana Mirza Postdoctoral Fellow in the Jaffer Center for Muslim World Studies at FIU. His research focuses on international political theory, international historical sociology, Kashmir, South Asia, and post-colonial and decolonial conceptions of the international. Mohammed Homayun Bash is the director of the Jaffer Institute for Interfaith Dialogue and Education at Miami-Dade College. He is also an affiliated faculty member at the Jaffer Center for Muslim World Studies at FIU. His research interests include strategic studies, foreign policy, and international relations of the Middle East. He will be followed by Iqbal Akhtar, Associate Professor with dual appointments in the Departments of Religious Studies and Politics and International Relations at FIU. He is also the founding director of the Western Indian Studies Initiative and the director of the Jain Studies Program. Currently, his research is focused on reconstructing the 18th century religious cosmology of the Sindhi Khoja. And finally, but definitely not least, is Ms. Anna Ramshah, who is currently an Urdu language Fulbright FTL, visiting Florida International University. She holds an MPhil degree in applied linguistics and a master's degree in English language teaching from University of Management and Technology in Lahore, Pakistan. So after Ms. Ramshah's comments, we will again open the floor for discussion. Please post your questions in the link for Q&A. Thank you. Mr. Qureshi, you have the floor.
I will, the topic of my talk is Introduction to Iqbal's Worldview and Philosophy, which you can also call Iqbal's Interpretation of Islam. Just a few words about the context of his time. Allama Iqbal was born on 9th of November, that is today, in 1877 and died on 21st of April 1938 at the age of 61. His years of maturity was a time of great political and scientific upheaval. Nearly the entire Muslim world was under colonial rule. In the field of knowledge, the Muslim world had stagnated for nearly 600 years, while the West had made tremendous strides in science and other domains of knowledge. The outbreak of First World War led to the weakening of imperial powers, thereby opening the possibilities of freedom for the Muslim world. This, from Iqbal's standpoint, was a great opportunity for the Muslim world to reclaim its lost glory. Great scientific discoveries, such as the theory of relativity and development of quantum physics, shook the foundations of classical Newtonian science and reshaped our view of the cosmos. Iqbal was a keen student of both modern knowledge and Islam, its law, polity, history, culture, and literature. This combination of modern knowledge and a thorough study of Islam and the Holy Quran gave him a special insight and opened for him the possibility of combining divine revelation with modern knowledge. Before talking about Iqbal's interpretation, let me introduce two existing interpretations of Islam. And first one is Sufi Islam. Main proponent of this interpretation was Imam Ghazali, a 12th century Muslim scholar who forcefully proposed that it was not possible to know the divine reality through knowledge arising from sense perception. He made his case through an important work titled The Incoherence of the Philosophers. He proposed that the knowledge of divine reality was only possible through intuition and meditation. Many scholars and historians believe that Ghazali's immense influence greatly retarded the development of science and art in the Muslim world. Over the centuries, however, eminent Sufi mystics were able to spread Islam in many regions of Asia, especially the Indian subcontinent. The second is political Islam. This interpretation developed in the early and middle part of the 20th century, and one of its important proponents was Maulana Maududi. This was the time when most of the Islamic countries were struggling for or in the process of achieving independence. This approach proposes that it is the duty of Muslims to practically implement Islam in the world. Maududi believed that only preaching Islam was not enough. Islam had to be practically implemented through the state apparatus, for which attaining political power was necessary. His ideas had significant political appeal, due to which Islamist political parties and movements emerged in many Islamic countries. This approach clashes with the dominant idea of our time, which envisions a separation of state and religion. IS and Taliban are more extreme versions of this idea, which combine militancy and terrorism to capture political power. Coming over to Iqbal's interpretation of Islam, he articulated his vision of Islam through a series of 7 lectures, which were later printed in the form of a book titled The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam. He starts by examining the potential of modern knowledge and a revelational religious experience in providing answers to certain fundamental questions facing humanity, relating to the nature and structure of the universe, the existence of nature of divine reality in the constitution of the universe, and the place, role, and conduct of humanity. While discussing the development of modern knowledge, he highlights the role of two influential scholars, and these are Immanuel Kant and Imam Ghazali, and their impact on the Western and modern Muslim worlds. Both these scholars strongly advocated that knowledge about divine reality could not be attained through the knowledge arising from sense perception. However, their impact was very different. Kant's effort struck a blow to Christianity and led to what we might call the secularization of knowledge in the West. Imam Ghazali, on the other hand, drove the Muslims away from modern knowledge and gave rise to what I earlier mentioned, meditative or Sufi Islam. Iqbal criticizes Ghazali for creating an unnecessary cleavage between knowledge and religious experience, and by implication between thought and intuition. Iqbal makes a strong case that modern knowledge, which is the study of God's creation, will give us an insight into the nature of the Creator. Thus, human thought arising from sense perception is perfectly capable of knowing the Creator. He also quotes the Quran, which on numerous occasions urges its followers to study nature as it is a sign of God. Iqbal also highlights the comparative capabilities of thought and intuition, the two human faculties of assimilating knowledge. He says that thought focuses on the temporal aspect of reality, while intuition targets its eternal aspect. While thought examines reality piecemeal, intuition sees it as a whole. Both are complementary and need each other for mutual rejuvenation. Talking about religious experience, Iqbal points out that the ultimate reality not only enters our consciousness through sense perception, but also directly through intuition. Also, religious experience has been too enduring and dominant in the history of mankind to dismiss it as mere illusion. For Iqbal, the template of religious experience is that of all prophets, especially Prophet Muhammad, which resulted in the revelation of the Holy Quran. Having made a strong case for the authenticity and importance of both modern and religious knowledge, he makes a bold claim that analysis of modern knowledge can validate and confirm the knowledge received through religious experience. Hence, the title of the next chapter of his book is The Philosophical Test of the Revelation of Religious Experience, which we might call Iqbal's Metaphysics. To start with, Iqbal criticizes the arguments of natural theology that seek to prove the existence of God, mainly on the grounds that they view the creator and his creation as two separate entities opposing each other, and give a picture as if the creator operates on his creation from without. He points out that the study of nature does not reveal the externality of the creator with regards to his creation. He suggests that the problem arises as these arguments view thought as an agency working on things from without. He suggests that it is possible to view thought as a potency that is within and formative of the very being of its materials. According to him, the duality between thought and being, as we see in the human situation, is not the case with the Creator. In him, thought and being are ultimately one. In short, Iqbal points out that the Creator and creation are organically related, that the Creator operates on his creation from within. This appears to be a pantheistic view of reality, but he works around this problem by suggesting that the Creator is a spiritual being, while the material universe is only a partial manifestation of his creative life. He then examines the three levels of human experience, which is matter, life, and consciousness. In examining matter, he points out that Einstein's theory of relativity and quantum physics have dismantled the materialism accentuated by Newtonian physics. He refers to Whitehead's process philosophy that views nature not as a static fact, but as a system of interrelated events possessing a continuous creative flow. At the quantum level, we know that matter gets created and uncreated, that it can oscillate between being material and immaterial. Also, quantum physics tells us that mere observation brings about changes in the behavior of subatomic particles. In short, modern physics tells us that matter also possesses a degree of spirituality and consciousness. Coming to life and consciousness, Iqbal is strongly opposed to the chemical and mechanical interpretation of life and consciousness. In his view, life and consciousness are foundational and anterior to the physical and chemical processes of living beings. He suggests that life and consciousness have primacy over the material body, which is only a medium for the self-expression of life and consciousness. Then what do we conclude from these arguments? While the nature of the creator is spirituality pervades the entire creation as well. In short, Iqbal concludes that the spiritual nature of reality intuitionally revealed through religious experience is similar to the metaphysical reality that our sensory knowledge reveals to us. In the next two chapters, Iqbal talks about the conception of God and human ego, its freedom and immortality. In theological terms, he terms God as the ultimate ego and explains some of his characteristics. He views the ultimate ego not as an all pervasive cosmic spirituality, but as a unique, peerless, and perfect individual. He points out that an individual can only be perfect if he neither begets nor is begotten. God is constantly and intimately involved in the creative process. His creativity is boundless. The universe is only a temporal and partial manifestation of his creative life. He is not only the creator, but also the sustainer of his creation. Iqbal explains that God's infinitude does not entail spatial extensity, rather, it means spiritual intensity. He quotes a Quranic surah that best defines God. And I quote, "Say, God is one, all things depend on him. He begets not, nor is he begotten, and there is none like unto him." Unquote. Iqbal extends his concept of egohood to man and to nature. And he says that every atom of divine energy is an ego. Matter, therefore, is an aggregation of lower order egos, and from their combination, higher order egos emerge. This combination reaches near perfection in human beings. Iqbal attaches great significance to the spiritual essence of the human being and calls it the human ego. It is the center of directive energy and the organizing principle of the human being. He points out that the human ego, once created, is immortal. It becomes an eternal constituent of being. It will, however, move from state to state. Iqbal is a strong proponent of human free will. He points out that the future is uncreated. It is an open possibility. God has curtailed his own freedom voluntarily to make room for human freedom. Man is thus a partner and co-worker in God's creative process. Iqbal devotes one chapter to the difficult question of flexibility in the structure of Islam. In that, he points out that nothing in the Holy Quran can be repealed nor suspended, but there is enough flexibility in its interpretation to suit modern times. In his view, the rest of the structure of Islam can be adapted to suit modern times. He, however, admits that conservatism in Islam makes this process difficult. In the last chapter of his book, he asks an interesting question: is religion possible? He describes the three stages of religious life, which are faith, reason, and discovery. The first stage involves unquestioned obedience to religious commands. The second stage relates to a rational understanding of religious concepts and precepts. In the third stage, religious life develops the ambition to develop direct contact and association with God. It is in regard to this third stage that he asks the question: is religion possible? This stage of religious life is also called mysticism or Sufism. He points out that mysticism for him is not a life denying, fact avoiding phenomena as is commonly perceived. He relates this religious quest with the scientific process. Though involving different methods, they are identical in their aims. Both aim to reach the most real. For both, the way to reach pure objectivity lies through what can be called purification of experience. He then makes some very profound observations. He says that the eternal secret of the human ego is that the moment it reaches this final revelation, it recognizes it as the ultimate root of his being without the slightest hesitation. The technique of reaching this goal is through deed, contemplation, and worship. The ultimate aim of the ego is not to see something, but to be something by sharpening his objectivity and acquiring a more fundamental I am. The end of ego's quest is not emancipation from the limitations of individuality. It is, on the other hand, a more precise definition of individuality. The final act is not an individual but a vital act, which deepens his whole being, sharpens his will with the creative assurance that world is not something to be seen or known through concepts, but something to be made and remade by continuous action. It is a moment not only of supreme bliss, but also a moment of great trial. Now, in order to give you a flavor of his poetry, I will quote a few verses that reflect this view of Iqbal from his famous poem Javed Nama. And I quote, "Are you in the stage of life, death, or death in life? Invoke the aid of three witnesses to verify your station. The first witness is your own consciousness. See yourself then with your own light. The second witness is the consciousness of another ego. See yourself then in the light of an ego other than yours. The third witness is God's consciousness. See yourself then in God's light. If you stand unshaken in front of his light, consider yourself as living and eternal as he. That man alone is real who dares see God face to face. What is ascension? Only a search for a witness who may finally confirm his reality, a witness whose confirmation alone makes you eternal. No one can stand unshaken in his presence, and he who can verily is pure gold." Unquote. And lastly, I'll briefly talk about Iqbal's political ideas. Iqbal was of the view that Islam created a political and social structure that was regulated by a legal system and animated by a specific ethical ideal. In his view, Islam does not bifurcate the unity of man into an irreconcilable duality of spirit and matter. In Islam, God and universe, spirit and matter, mosque and the state are organic to each other. It is on this basis that he proposed that Muslims were a distinct community. Hence, Muslim majority areas in India should be granted an autonomous status, a demand that later became the basis of the two-nation theory and led to the partition of India. Iqbal was of the view that in Islam, the idea that religion is a private affair and has nothing to do with the state is neither feasible nor workable. Much of the turmoil in the modern day Islamic world can be viewed as a tussle between the secular and Islamist ideas and forces. Pertinent examples are Egypt, Turkey, Syria, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. To conclude, let me just reflect on what is Iqbal telling us on his 144th birthday. He is telling the Islamic world to absorb and develop modern knowledge in order to develop a vision of Islam that fits modern times. He is advising Islamic mystics to absorb and use divine energy to remake themselves and the world. He points out that political Islam is a reality, but the road to its success is not through militancy and coercion, but through developing, presenting, and implementing a refined version of Islam. In short, he is presenting a wholesome picture of Islam that energizes Sufi Islam, refines political Islam, and incorporates what can be called intellectual Islam, thus emphasizing Islam's enormous ability to absorb and accommodate a broad range of ideas within its framework. He is telling humanity in general to reclaim its spirituality, live soulfully, thereby achieving greater harmony between humans and with nature. Finally, he is giving a unified vision of reality in which God, nature, and humanity coexist in a spiritualized realm. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Qureshi, for this wonderful introduction, which was actually more than an introduction, it was quite in depth on the life and philosophy, the thought and religion of Allama Iqbal. And without further ado, I leave the floor to Dr. Ligori, please.
Thank you, and also thank you, Mr. Qureshi, for that wonderful introduction to Iqbal's thought. I'd just like to situate Iqbal's thought within the various contexts in which he lived and communicated. So this began first in his native town of Sialkot, where he was brought up. He came from Kashmiri background, which settled in Sialkot sometime in a few decades before, perhaps his grandfather or great-grandfather. But after going to Scotch Mission College there, he then enrolled into the Government College of Lahore. And it's there that he came into contact with Thomas Arnold. And he kind of shined as Arnold's star pupil. Arnold was a professor of Oriental Studies and was also a close friend of Shibli Nomani and close contact also of Syed Ahmed Khan, who was in his twilight years at this time. And it's through Arnold that he came into contact with some of these other figures and later ended up getting a teaching position at Oriental College of Lahore, where Arnold was president. And then goaded by Arnold and then funded by his brother to study in England, where he went to Cambridge University. It's there that he came into contact with John MacTaggart, who was a famous neo-Hegelianism, which was in vogue in Cambridge at the time, and also Reynold Nicholson, who was an Orientalist scholar who would later go on to translate Iqbal's Asrar Khudi, Secrets of the Self. He then took a bit of a vacation and submitted a doctoral dissertation while in Germany at Munich under Professor Hummel, entitled The Development of Metaphysics in Persia. And it's largely due to this work by Iqbal that the figures of Shahabuddin Yahya ibn Halash Suravardi and Hadi Sabzavari and Mullah Sadra came into a more sustained study in the West, which hadn't been grappled with before Iqbal's intervention. Upon coming back to India, British India in 1908, this is where we see the development of some of his works in The Secrets of the Self, and much later the reconstruction of religious thought and the Javed-Nama. But it's after this time where we start to see a shift in emphasis in some of the aspects of Iqbal's thought, and we see a move from Hegelianism to more of the vitalist philosophers, especially Henri Bergson and Friedrich Nietzsche, who come to the fore quite visibly in the way in which Iqbal wants to use Islam in particular as a means of self-strengthening, as a means of self-assertion in opposition to the colonial atmosphere that it was around at the time. And part of his targets that he's aiming at are particular strands of Sufism, not the Sufism that he's trying to enunciate. The Sufism that he was particularly fond of, even though his father was Qadiriya, and he had some familiarity with that growing up, was the Naqshbandiya philosophy, the silsila of Sheikh Ahmed Sarhindi, also known as the renewer of the millennium, Mujaddid Afghani. And in Afghani, he also sees a rejection of what he sees as pantheism of the Badat of Wajud, which was the understanding of God's omnipresence that is associated with the school of Ibn Arabi. So for Iqbal, he sees generally self-negating Sufism to be not taking up this mantle of assertion, of self-strengthening, and to be, and he uses quite vivid imagery in the Javed Nama to ultimately associate this with some type of religious failing. And he does this with the figures of Ahriman and Zoroaster, and Ahriman trying to goad Zoroaster into a life of passivity, rejecting his kind of prophetic duty. So prophecy maintains a central role also for Iqbal. And it's through the medium of poetry that individuals should be, that he uses poetry as a medium to push for positive action in the world. In particular, he uses kind of borrowing and remaking concepts borrowed from Nietzsche of the overman as what he calls the Martemoman, which is like the human or the man of faith, of religion, because it's through this kind of intuitionist understanding, but a call for action within the world towards the self-strengthening. So poetry can never be for its own sake, art could never be for its own sake, but it has to have a positive impact in the world in order to really be true to its calling. And when speaking about the politics of Iqbal, this was not something that he left by the sidelines at all, as well as laid out by Mr. Qureshi. He was actively involved in politics. He was part of the Punjab Legislative Council from 1926 onwards, and then took a leading role in the Muslim League. And it's through moves that he made in the Allahabad decree and eventually reconciling with Jinnah that led to eventually the Lahore Resolution and the call for Pakistan. So it's also interesting to look at some of the things that he was dealing with internationally, calling for pan-Islam, which he simultaneously used as a tool for combating global racism of the 1920s and 1930s. And he was particularly critical of Ataturk and Pan-Turanianism, and used kind of imagery from earlier Islam, like the Shoabi movement, to kind of speak against racial superiority or any kind of preeminence of role to Arab society over any other Muslim society. I think I've gone about my time, but in order to segue to Professor Humayun Vesh, it's interesting that the first International Iqbal Conference was held in Tehran in 1986, and then President and now Supreme Leader Khamenei referred to the Iranian resolution as the carrying through with the program of Iqbal as a positive self-assertion for the Muslim world in opposition to colonialism. So I'll give it up there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ligori. And Dr. Humayun Vash, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I need to really appreciate you being here, Nicey. I know you're going through some rough patches, so we do definitely appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time to moderate this event today. And what a timely event in a lot of ways. And thank you, Professor Qureshi, and also Dr. Ligori, And that was a beautiful segue. You know, TJ also talked about Sayyid Ahmed Khan, and when I think about, you know, Ahmed Khan and contrast him to Iqbal, you see Ahmed Khan as this kind of traditionally educated, you know, Muslim who's seeking to make modern Western liberal thought Islamically palatable, at least, you know, acceptable. And Iqbal is the exact opposite. He's this, you know, this modern Western educated Muslim who is trying to reinterpret Islam in conjunction with his understanding of a Western thought to demonstrate Islam's relevance as a viable alternative to, you know, to maybe the Christian West, but also to Marxist ideologies. So, and that's, I think, the genius of Iqbal's, you know, approach to Western civilization. And in one of his maybe more memorable passages that I've written here, he talks about the Prophet Muhammad's legacy. He says the nature, and I quote, the nature of the Prophet's religious experience as disclosed in the Quran is wholly different from that of Christianity. It is an individual experience creative of a social order. Its immediate outcome is the fundamentals of a polity with implicit legal concepts whose civic significance cannot be belittled merely because their origin is revelational. The religious ideal of Islam is organically related to the social order which it has created. So this sometimes dichotomy between reason / rationality and revelation, which, you know, which a lot of, you know, Muslim intellectuals have grappled with, I think Iqbal has again a very genius way of reconciling that seeming, you know, friction between reason and revelation, and this again very big assertion that that what the Prophet did was an individual experience that constituted a social order. And he contrasts that with, you know, with the Christian experience. So this this way of, you know, synthesizing modern humanism with, you know, with Eastern morality, if you will, is probably one of the most important and lasting legacies of Iqbal's thought. And as Mr. Qureshi also mentioned, he views Islam as this, you know, unifying force, but a unifying force whose moral and mystical dimensions is open to, you know, to Indian elements, for example. Even he mentions, you know, Chinese elements that could theoretically be incorporated into this unifying you know, force that is Islam. And it has to do with, obviously, with his background. You know, he's Indian, but he's an Indian Muslim, but he's an Indian Muslim from, you know, Punjab, but also he's Kashmiri. He, you know, he belongs to this high caste that is not, you know, high caste anymore in, you know, in the hierarchy in India. So he's kind of the minority of the minority, if you will. And I think it's important to understand that background when we approach Iqbal. And what is striking to me in the context of Iqbal in the kind of Persianite world is his love for the Persian language. I mean, Dr. Misbahi, before we began, he mentioned that, you know, he thought going to high school that Iqbal was Persian, and that is absolutely true. I mean, this guy's poetry is so eloquent that it is impossible for anyone to realize that he's not a native speaker of Persian. I don't know of any other non-native speaker who has you know, the you know, style of prose and poetry that Iqbal has. So we could put him, I think, in terms of the beauty of his Persian poetry, up there with the most, you know, I don't know, the luminaries of Persian poetry, maybe like Rumi, maybe even Hafiz and Sa'di, but the kind of poetry that as Professor Liguori mentioned serves a function. It's not poetry just for the sake of aesthetics or beautiful language. It serves in all his Persian work. If you look at them, his poetry is serving this function of being a catalyst for Iqbal to make his sophisticated ideas maybe more easily digestible to the audience. And throughout his life, Iqbal prefers writing in Persian, as he believes this allows him to more fully express his philosophical concepts, and it gives him a wider audience. And he loves Iran, but remember that Iqbal actually never goes to Iran throughout his life. I think he takes a couple of trips to Afghanistan, but that's about him. He mentions, I saw somewhere that he loves Iran so much that he writes many times in his works that if Tehran was Geneva, the world would change. And the credit for popularizing Iqbal in Iran should go to the ideologue of the Iranian Revolution, Dr. Ali Shariati, who writes a seminal work on Iqbal. Actually, this is not a written work. These are his lectures that are compiled in a book called Ma wa Iqbal, or Iqbal and Us. And it really creates this ripple effect in Iran at the time. Shariati is deeply impacted by Iqbal and his reformist, Islamic spirit. Shariati introduces Iqbal as a multifaceted personality who in philosophical thought rises to the level of someone like Bergson in the West, and he puts him on the same level as Abu Hamid al-Ghazali in Islamic thought. So this is the way he's being viewed by Shariati. And I don't believe anywhere else in the world Iqbal's work has been explicated as thoroughly as in Iran. Iqbal's thoughts, his poetry, they're all very well known and widely read even today in Iran, and comprise part of the spiritual heritage that is remembered in Iran. And I see. Do I have like 1 or 2 more minutes, or am I talking too much?
We're slightly behind, but
okay. I just wanted to recite. Okay, maybe one of his Persian, like very short passage from one of his poems in Persian. Remember, most of Iqbal's poetry and the most sophisticated of Iqbal's poetry is actually in Persian and not in Urdu. So I think if you really want to capture the totality of Iqbal's thought, you need to be able to read it in Persian. I don't know what percentage of his work in Persian has been translated into English or Urdu for that matter. But this is one of Iqbal's, maybe most touching Persian poems from his Payam al-Mashriq, or The Message from the East, that is published in Persian in 1923. It's a philosophical poetry, and I just read a few lines in Persian and then I'll translate. He says, نه افغانیم و نه ترک و تاتاریم، چمنزادیم و از یک شاخساریم، تمیز رنگ و بو بر ما حرام است که ما پرورده یک نوبهاریم. And the translation is, we are neither Afghans nor Turks or Tatars. We are from the same garden and the same branch. Discrimination based on color is prohibited among us. All of us have been cultured by the same spring. And I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
I'm glad I gave you that extra minute so you could read that poem. That was beautiful. Thank you. Without further ado, Dr. Akhtar, actually a little bit of a further ado, we miss you very much, Dr. Akhtar. So it's wonderful to see you, at least via Zoom.
Thank you so much, Professor Sardoui. Thank you very much, Ambassador General Qureshi, for the wonderful lecture. We really appreciate it. Professor Lagori, Professor Hamayanvash, Professor Mezbahi, Professor Sardui, Umar and Muhammad and Anna. Thank you so much for all of your help in putting this wonderful session together. And it's an honor to be here, and I'm glad that I was able to facilitate in some small way this wonderful sort of dialogue of Iqbal and bringing Iqbal to FIU and to Miami and to a whole new group of people who have an interest in learning about his ideas. I don't have much to say, but I just wanted to think about Iqbal. We talked a little bit about Iqbal's history, about his impact in Iran and sort of the Persian world. I just wanted to sort of think about and sort of, rather than remark, to ask just some questions that perhaps we can talk about a little bit more in terms of thinking about the relevance of Iqbal on contemporary Pakistani society. So if Iqbal would have been alive, what would he have made of modern day Pakistan? So he had an idea for a place that would safeguard the rights of Muslims of the subcontinent. But as Muhammad, has articulated, and the professor has also articulated, and the ambassador has also articulated, his ideas were extremely deep. They were not jingoistic. They were deeply rooted in Islamic civilization, but also in the context of that civilization, in which it was grounded in local culture and language and history. It had its own sort of mystical tradition as well. And many of those aspects of his ideas are quite lost on the majority of Pakistanis, who kind of just know him very briefly from history because he helped to create the idea or develop that idea with Jinnah for the creation of the society. But the question is that in a world where religion plays a receding role in public life, where capitalism and materialism tend to be the new religions of the majority of humanity, what space does Iqbal play? And I think one of the great tragedies, I think, of the way that Pakistani history has played out has been the ease by which Allama Iqbal was embedded within local culture and could connect to Hindu and Jain and Sikh sort of idioms, imagery, culture. Much of that is lost on modern Pakistanis. They don't necessarily have that capacity, that fluency. So the partition, as much as it safeguarded the rights of Pakistanis, something was lost in the capacity to be able to learn from the other, or to be able to hold a firm connection to Islamic culture, but that not necessarily having to be something that is exclusionary. That you could be grounded within the sort of the breadth and the depth of Islamic civilization, and also be able to interact and learn from other societies and cultures and languages. And so I think that is one of the things that I would try to highlight from Iqbal's sort of poetry, and the beauty of the message is that he also advocates for a type of pluralism, I should say, or maybe even the family as the humanity as family, and being able to learn from others and from the other. That the whole process that we have embarked upon in terms of othering, that this person belongs, this person doesn't belong, this person is the majority, this person is the minority. I think when you read especially the more mystical poetry, it's very clear that he doesn't believe in that at all. And my favorite text for Allama Iqbal is always shikwa jawab shikwa. It's the complaint against God. And I think that's something that is just such a powerful, and originally he didn't even write the jawab. It was actually just the shikwa, which was just a complaint against God, that, and it's such a powerful statement, because now I don't think in Pakistan, you would find poets that would be able to write so boldly. And that idea of shikwa comes really not out of an Islamic tradition, but it really comes out of, say, the Indic Bhakti tradition, actually, where you actually have this idea that that the divine is close to you, that God is, you know, we when we talk about sort of God, we refer to him as the most intimate, right? Even within the Urdu grammar, so that you can both love God and also be angry at God, and you can also love God and try to grapple with injustice and the inhumanity that you see around you. So I think that that's just I really love that that aspect of it, that he was so grounded in an ancient form of poetry and tradition that unfortunately I think is not so present anymore, or it's hidden, and perhaps through Pakistani sort of learning more about it, having more of these sorts of conferences, and particularly from what Professor Humayun Vash was saying, connecting with the Persian scholarship of it, Pakistani society can be can understand the richness and the fullness of Iqbal's poetry, and hopefully that also brings his ideas to bear, which have real resonance with the challenges of modern Pakistan. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Akhtar. It was lovely seeing you again. And without further ado, Ms. Ramsha, please.
Thank you everyone for joining us today for celebrating Iqbal Day. I'm honored to be a part of this event and to share my insights. So today I'll be touching on the poetic aspect of Iqbal. So in the first published collection of the poetry, Asrar-e-Khudi, Secrets of the Self. So the poem, it emphasizes the spirit and self from a religious and spiritual perspective. Iqbal proves by various means that the whole universe obeys the will of the selves. So the philosophy in self, Iqbal explained that use of term khudi, it's like synonym with the word of ruh, spirit, as mentioned in Quran. So, however, one has to make a great journey of transformation to realize that divine spark, which Iqbal calls khudi. A similitude of this journey, it could be understand by the relationship of fragrance and seed. So every seed, you see, it has the potential for fragrance within it. But to reach its fragrance, the seed must go through different stages. First breaking out of its shells, then breaking the ground and into light, developing roots at the same time, and then fighting against the elements to develop leaves and flowers, and finally reaching its pinnacle by attaining the fragrance that was hidden within it. So in the same way, to reach one's khudi, one's self, or ruh, spirit, one needs to go through these stages, which Iqbal himself went through, spiritual path which he encouraged others to travel. And many die along the way incomplete. And in the same way, only a few people could climb that Mount Everest of spirituality. Most just get consumed along the way by materialism. So this dominant idea that Iqbal emphasizes is that knowing oneself, it is in fact an immediate perception of God. He focuses his attention on the individual I, the shifting the emphasis from divine to human. The path of recognition of the self, it is the path that take one to contact with the absolute. So Iqbal's whole conception of the growth of the selfhood, it consists of three levels. The first is the self and I, it is intrapersonal. The second level is the self and the other, interpersonal. The third level is the self and the God, transpersonal. So the secrets of the self, the book, Iqbal has pictured an infinite potentialities of the human self. He formulated these stages in which it can be achieved. In the poem, he has defined what an individual life is and what its motive is and how it should be developed, what is its goal and how that goal can be reached. So the human self is the heart of Iqbal's concept of self in the poem. And at the start of the poem, Iqbal invites the reader and gives a call for realization of the selfhood. I am now just going to recite a few lines from the poem, The Secrets of the Self, Israr Khudi. So this is like the translated version in English, so the majority of the audience can understand. The original one is in Persian. So this bell calls other travelers to take the road. No one had told the secret, told the secret which I will tell, or threaded a pearl of thought like mine. Come, if thou would know the secret of everlasting life. Come, if thou would win both earth and heaven. Heaven taught me this lore. I cannot hide it from comrades. In a confident and candid tone, Iqbal invites the reader to taste the secret of eternal life that lies in the realization of selfhood. Moreover, he is certain and sure of the fact that the bell he is ringing would be responded positively. And this assurance comes from his own strength that he gathered after mastering self. So now I will conclude that the perfect man of Iqbal is not a superman, nor he should realize his inner power. So this is the key feature of his dynamic Sufism that has a note of universality in it. His perfect man does exhibit the qualities of Maslow's self-actualized person or Whitman's divine average, but does excel in the manifestation of his individuality and his spiritual ideal. Therefore, central to Iqbal's drama in this poem is his concern with human individuality. His vision is a reminder of the universal commonalities of human diversity and the creative powers that may well be the most unifying force in the global family. So that was the analysis of Israr Khudi, the self. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ramsha. All right, so some of you guys are writing your questions in the chat and some in the Q&A, and I'm trying to look at both and make sure that I cover everyone. I'm not going to ask any questions myself. I'm going to give the opportunity for the audience to be able to listen to some responses to the questions they have raised. Again, please use the Q&A so that I can make sure that I see your questions. The first question, how does Allama Iqbal's writing, Sare Jahan Se Acha Hindustan Hamara, synchronize with the two-nation theory? He is referring to Hindustan, which refers to an area where Hindus and Muslims lived. He did not refer to an Islamistan and Hindustan. Do you think his thinking changed over time because of the divide and rule policy of the British? That's the first question. I'm not sure who would like to address that. If there's anybody that wants to take it up. Mr. Qureshi, please.
Thank you. Allama Iqbal died in 1938. That was before the Lahore resolution, in which the claim for Pakistan was put up. But his ideas were that initially it was important to get freedom from the British. That is one aspect. And secondly, he is also cognizant of what is happening in the subcontinent, that there is a tussle of dominance between Hindus, and so he's trying to balance out two things. And in the 1930 address that he made in Allahabad, which is very famous, he does not talk about independence. He talks about having some autonomous Muslim states in the northwest, which is now West Pakistan. And he's saying that there is some communal tension between the Hindus and the Muslims, And the best way to contain it is to give autonomy to the Muslims, because Muslim is a different community. They want to live and they want to develop themselves as Muslims. And so at that point, he's not talking about a separate Pakistan, just an autonomous region. And he makes very cogent remarks in which he's saying that there is a way in which Hindus and Muslims can live in unity in India at that time. So it is a later development when between Hindus, between Congress and Muslim League, there could not be any political settlement and agreement, and there was tension. And so that is how that idea of autonomy then they later on became the two nation theory, and then a separate demand for Pakistan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another question, could anyone please succinctly throw light on Dr. Iqbal's view of Marxism-Leninism, and how does he reconcile this approach with his well-established belief in Islamic monotheism or Tawheed? Not sure if anybody, Mohammed, would you like to catch that one? Dr.
Yeah, actually, I was reading about it a few days ago about Iqbal's initial fascination with with these principles of socialism in general. The fact that he's generally attracted to socialism by this idea of unity and equality of mankind, which brings that notion of Tawheed or monotheism very broadly conceived, obviously, for Iqbal, in line with that. But obviously, they part ways because Iqbal is, opposed to the materialistic view of, Karl Marx, and he doesn't believe in this materialistic interpretation of modern socialism of the West. But close to, to Shariati, he's very sympathetic to the spiritual socialism that brings it closer to Islam. So in that sense, you see, I think, some overlap and presence of socialism, and the fact that he's very interested in this Bolshevik revolution in Russia, and he regards this as this storm that could potentially open some doors for others as well. And he writes, I think, in his poetry in quite laudatory terms about the the October Revolution in Russia, and he asks all the workers of the world to get a lesson from that that October Revolution of 1917. But like atheism and materialism, that is so inherent to to that ideology. I think those two elements obviously do not sit well with Iqbal.
Thank you very much. One further question. Reading Iqbal's poetry, he was against sultanate preachers and politicians. In your opinion, what is his concept of how community should function? Not sure if anybody has an answer to that one, or if we have a volunteer.
I can say a few words.
Go ahead, Dr. Misbahi.
A wonderful conversation. I think TJ raised his hand for the previous question. Maybe he can jump in. I think, my fascination with Iqbal, as little as I know about him, is that his enormous relevancy to our time, actually. And that relevancy is the symbiosis of what he considered to be an agency, that is, what are we doing in this world individually, and how we act on this platform. And then what is the conditionality of this agency, which is that the structures around us, whether it's a political structure, economic structure, and so on, and what type of interaction between this agency and structure is expected in Iqbal's perspective. And I think that's where that's where Shariati is so familiar, because Shariati copies and pick up on him and articulate this position of agency, structure, so society versus individual. And therefore, the result is, and that you saw in Shariati's writing, and of course in Iqbal, is a very, very unusual type of Muslimness. Muslimness, which is on the one hand, is very private, individualized, has a special type of relationship with God that nobody has access to. And that is the Sufism of mysticism that he talks about. And the other one is active involvement in the society, addressing major issues of concern, social justice, political justice, colonialism, capitalism, modernity, and all that. Now, to combine these two has been the difficulty of all philosophers, left and right. You know, Marx left it to the structure, and agency basically is automations. You just react to it, you know. And Shariati was critical of that, and of course, Iqbal too. And I think, you know, given our condition now today, that modernity, Marxism, communism, which are all variations of modernity, and capitalism on the top of that, or in parallel to that, and the environmental crisis that we have, it requires a response to it, which cannot be done by rationality. It has to be done with a combination of an agency, which is both spiritual and rational. And I think that is the incredible relevance of people like Iqbal. And that is why it's ironic that given that he's not really being discovered as much in the West as other Muslim activists or thinkers have been discovered and talk about it, Qutb and Maududi and others. I think they all pale in comparison to him because of his enormous relevancy to the questions of what do we do in this world that's not indifferent to what we do to it. I mean, if you think about the whole history, I mean, theory of the Anthropocene discussion, that we are changing the environment, we're changing the nature, actually. For the first time, we discovered that now. And the idea of a wholeness of life, that this nature would react to you and destroys you if you don't accommodate that, you know. And then the questions of consumerism at the core of development question. It cannot be dealt with without the notion of spirituality at all. And without the notion of contentment in life. And contentment is very contrarian to the drive of modernity, capitalism, productions, and so on. And that is why I found him enormously relevant, not just to Pakistan's life, but also to Iranians' life, to Muslim life, and to the American life everywhere. And that's why Anne-Marie Schimmel loves him so much. And he prefers him to Kant and Hegel and others. And this is exactly, it reminds me this metaphor of, you know, who is the most archetypal Muslims, and Shariati says, you know, those who are Parsayan at night, the worshippers at night, and the lions of the day. And they come alive in the day, simultaneously, not sequentially. And this is a major question. If you read Charles Taylor's book on the question of modernity, he said modernity has succeeded because God and spirituality has become an option. Not a real story, but an option. And there is an immanency of life, immanency of frame of life, that is life here for now, the pleasure of it, access to it, versus the directionality of life. And I think I can see it from justice movement in the United States, race movement in the United States and Western countries, and then COVID, this idea that if we don't think like Iqbal, we practically have no chance. And that is my belief. And that is his global relevance. And I'm not sure Iqbal's idea, I think that's a question that was raised before, if he comes back now and he's alive again, what does he think about Pakistan or Iran or South Asia and all that? I think he would face the same question. I don't think Iqbal would fit into a Westphalian system. I don't think he can be accommodated with Westphalian system, whether in a Kantian version of it which is sort of this wishy-washy liberalism, or the Hegelian version, which is fascism, and so on, you know. So I think he's the product of a state being ephemeral somewhere on the corner. Society is the strong one. Individuals are the real stories, not states. While the story of the 20th century, Marxism, liberalism, is empowerment of a state versus the individual. And therefore, Iqbal is an answer to that, as Shariati was in his thinking to that. But the Iranian Revolution also could not handle the Westphalian system. And so the state became powerful again. And even if it was an agency of change, and this happened the same thing. Look at the US government, so powerful. Russians, the same thing, powerful states run the life of people. And societies are struggling to find its own space. You know? And that is why I think it's so relevant to our discussion. Sorry for the elongated interventions. You know, but.
We have 3 minutes to closing. Thank you so much, Dr. Misbahi, for bringing in those points. I think it rounded up everything very nicely and answered some of the questions that I had as everyone was speaking. I think, let me see if we have one more time for one more question. Okay, just it's primarily a comment to establish a conversation on Dr. Ali Shariati and Allama Iqbal in the future. So we have made perhaps a topic of a future talk down the road. I don't know if Dr. Liguori, you wanted to answer that question. We only have 2 minutes left. Otherwise, I will wrap up.
Yeah, I was just going to make a point that overlapped a little bit with everybody's comments, and now just kind of overlaps a little bit more. But a lot of that that Iqbal was addressing was contextual and based on the needs of the Muslim community in the Punjab at the time. And to Dr. Akhtar's point, repeatedly he calls for a sustained engagement, not just tolerance of the Hindu community and respect for the Hindu community. And yeah, just kind of this had to deal with a means of strengthening the impoverished. And that's where he saw the relevance of Lenin's work, and not in the atheism, which he obviously rejected. So yeah, I fear a lot of my comments are just going to overlap a bit with everybody else's.
Thank you very much. And thank you to our audience for attending this wonderful event. I'm sure that I speak for everyone in saying that this has been absolutely wonderful, enlightening. I enjoyed so much hearing from each and every one of your perspectives. Thank you, Mr. Qureshi, for joining us from overseas. Dr. Iqbal, wonderful to see you. Dr. Akhtar Iqbal, wonderful to see you. Anna, thank you for joining us. I hope and I look forward to meeting you on campus. Dr. Homayun Bash, Dr. Liguori, Dr. Misbahi, on behalf of the Jafar Center for Muslim World Studies, thank you very much for attending, and have a safe and wonderful Wednesday, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.